Hi, how are you? I think that Jeanette Pertz has some background noise. So if you can mute yourself on the bottom of the screen, it will be much easier for Lynn and I to talk. I think that's good. Okay. So welcome to everyone. And how do we get, now Maris now just has to get Lynn on the center of the screen. Is she on the center of your screen?
When she starts talking, she should be.
Okay, great. Okay. So just reminding you, so Maris doesn't have to do it. Just if you can, just mute yourself, that would be great. And so this evening, I'm really, really happy to be speaking with Lynne Sharon Schwartz, who I think she's who I overlapped with at Iowa very briefly. She's an extremely distinguished writer with many, many fellowships and awards. And she's here to talk to us about her new collection of fiction, Truthtelling. So Lynn, where are you?
I'm right up here in the left-hand corner.
Okay. And Lynn is going to read, tell us what we're going to read. She's going to read for 5 minutes and then we'll begin our conversation. And then about the last 10 minutes, we'll open it up for questions from, those of us who've gathered on Zoom. You can write your questions down at the chat. And then Maris and I can curate them and ask them to Lynn as well. So welcome, Lynn. On the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I'm in New Jersey. Maris is in Brooklyn, and I'm sure there are people here from all over the world. Very excited to hear you read.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Maris and Cheryl, for inviting me. And thank you to all the people who came. It's wonderful. All those emails just really went to people. Okay. Sometimes I doubt if it works. I'm going to read a story from the new book. And the story is called Return of the Frenchman. I was wandering through the vast reaches and crannies of the enormous supermarket, which was reorganized every week so that it was hard to find even the most ordinary items, such as romaine lettuce, for which I searched to no avail. I gave up and decided to buy a loaf of bread, since I was standing right near the bread counter and the baker was smiling invitingly. I asked for a baguette, and he said he'd have to go in the back and get it. They were just coming out of the oven. A man appeared beside me, very smartly dressed in summer whites, a straw hat with a black band on his head. I'll take one too, he said. The baker nodded and disappeared into the back. The man turned to face me and smiled. Will you come away with me now? He asked. I was so startled I almost fell over. What could one possibly say to such a proposal from a stranger in the supermarket? He must have seen the shock on my face, for he added, why not? My car is just around the corner. We can stop off at your passport. Of course, I couldn't consider doing such a preposterous thing, but a change did come over me at his peculiar logic. Why not indeed? With his hat and white clothes, he was quite dashing. Why all the formalities and complexities attendant upon two people getting together? At that moment, the baker appeared with our baguettes and placed them in long bags. We each took a bag and I turned to go. The man said, a missed opportunity yet again. And then he touched his hat and walked away toward the cleaning supplies. Wait, I called after him. What do you mean again? Don't you remember that dinner party some years ago? That was when I realized it was the Frenchman come back. In fact, he had spoken with a very faint accent, which I hadn't noticed because of my shock. Also, he had said very few words. The dinner party he alluded to took place a few years ago when I was in my early 30s and happily, if somewhat agitatedly, married. Along with my husband and me were several other guests, including a French banker. He seemed a few years older than I and was probably with a wife or companion whom I've totally forgotten. He was fairly tall, very trim and well-built, and he wore a white dress shirt open at the collar, so that no tie. The white of his shirt was gleaming, whiter than white. It contrasted with his olive skin, and his very straight black hair, almost like Indian hair. He spoke excellent English, only a very slight accent. My feelings were unsettling. I was so drawn to this man that if he had taken me aside and asked me to run away with him that very night, I would have done so without hesitating. As we had drinks before dinner, I imagined him finding an excuse to whisper to me privately in the hall, suggesting a name and place for our elopement. We could arrange to leave the party together and grab a taxi to the airport, though I would have to go home for my passport, and so most likely would he. So an arrangement for tomorrow might be better. The presence of my husband did not deter me from my fantasies, although I loved him. The intensity of my feelings for the unknown Frenchman erased all other connections. He participated in the dinner table conversation graciously and intelligently. I wondered if he was having the same feelings for me as I was for him. After dinner, as we all sat around in the living room drinking coffee, I imagined he was addressing his remarks to me in particular, but I couldn't be sure. It would have suited my fantasies better had he spoken with a stronger French accent. The only drawback to our future life together was that he was a banker. I had negative attitudes about bankers for all the usual reasons. I wouldn't want to be closely associated with one, just as I wouldn't want to be closely associated with a petty criminal or a con man. But the magnetic pull I felt toward him overcame any reservations. It didn't matter what he was or did. Maybe he was a good banker, the kind that gave loans to poor homeowners or helped fund small third world businesses. The evening was pleasant enough, as such evenings go. The food was good, the conversation lively, the hosts gracious. We all said goodnight. Probably I shook hands with the banker and even the woman he was with. It didn't occur to me to catch him in a corner and suggest we meet somewhere for coffee in the next few days. Maybe invent some reason we should meet again. Advice about investments, say. I didn't know then how such things were managed, even if they were managed. I accepted that I would never see him again. Really, I'd known all evening that my fantasies would remain fantasies. I was even hoping that by the end of the dinner party, he would have said or done something unforgivable that would destroy the magnetism that yanked me towards him and that I resisted by an effort of will. But he didn't. He remained perfect. Had I been someone else, or had I been able to pretend I was someone else, I could have managed future meetings. But I wasn't someone else. I was set into who I was, like a cake batter poured into a mold. I'd never developed the imagination for such adventures. Since then, I've learned that many things I used to think were impossible are quite possible. And now the banker had reappeared. Obviously, his notion of the possible was considerably broader than mine. Once again, I'd let the opportunity slip away. If I had recognized him right away, would I have responded differently? Now he was lost in the cleaning supplies section, and though I pushed my cart swiftly through those aisles, I couldn't find him. I consoled myself by thinking maybe he wasn't even the same man, just an impudent stranger.
One of the first of all, one of the things I wanted to talk about. There was recently an article about Sigrid Nunez, her last two novels, which were really about older women, single women, mostly with pets, not with partners, navigating the landscape alone. And one of the strengths I feel about your collection is that almost all the stories feature strong women who are either alone or seem contented. You know, they have children, they're New Yorkers, they have very, very strong imaginations, which is kind of ironic given what you say in this story. And they're navigating the landscape usually happily on their own. You know, they have active sex lives, they're intellectually, adept, and they're really New Yorkers. And even when they're not the protagonist telling the story, like in the story I Want My Car, they're definitely the driving forces in their narrative. So I was wondering if that is a very conscious decision on your part as a writer to create these kind of strong women protagonists in your stories.
Well, actually, no. I'm very glad to hear that it comes out that way. But I don't think about it that way. I do one at a time, and these were written at very different periods, all in the last 3 or 4 years, but not all at once. But as far as New York, yes, it's been said about me, and I have to admit it's true. That it always sounds like it's in New York because that's what I know. I once had a story that was set in New York, but I couldn't print it. I couldn't publish it that way because I knew the people and I just couldn't do it. And my editor helped me set it in Chicago. He put all sorts of different place names in it just so it wouldn't sound like New York again. But I guess I was born and bred here, and I live here, and I write what I see around me. And I do see a lot of strong women around me. So yeah, but I don't know that I'm doing it consciously.
And are there one of the things that it says on the cover of the book, that truth-telling is stories, fables, and glimpses. So are some of these pieces, especially the shorter pieces, the anecdotes, the glimpses, are they nonfiction? Does it matter to you? I mean, it seems like they're all in one collection, so there's no real distinction between fiction and nonfiction.
Well, they're all fiction, except for one or two, but I don't want to say what they are. But the E.L. Doctorow said a long time ago, as the way things are going, there's not going to be fiction and nonfiction. There is only narrative. And I love that idea that, of course, there are places where you have to know the difference, like is in a newspaper, although that doesn't seem to hold true these days. But they're narratives. And if I read them thinking, oh, yes, this is true, then they're true. But I think they can also be read as fiction. The stories, fables, and glimpses, some of them are stories. Realistic stories where nothing, I mean, the story I just read is not obviously a realistic story. But there are some that are conventional stories. And then there are some that are almost fables. And then glimpses are very, very short. I think what I just read is too long to be a glimpse, but I have a few that are shorter. In fact, one was so short, it's called Pickup. It was a woman is standing in front of a hotel and a car comes by and she doesn't know what he's waiting for, but she gets in. I'm making it even shorter. And that one, my editor said, no, it's just too short. It's got to make something happen there. And so I did, and it came out to be more than a glimpse, a story. But there are some that are, there's one about a wrong number. How it's so odd sometimes you pick up a wrong number and the impulse is just to say it's a wrong number and when you hang up. But what happens if you get engaged with the person? And that's really about a page and a half. That's a glimpse. So I don't attempt in those stories to give you a thorough experience like a story would be, but it's enough so that it sets your imagination off and you almost can continue writing it on your own or imagining it on your own.
So how did you put this collection together? And why did you put Truth-telling as the first story and as the title story of the collection?
Well, I had been, usually whenever I wrote them over a period of 3 or 4 years, maybe 1 or 2 are older. But what I do, I have 3 other collections. When I have enough, when they pile up and I think, oh, there's almost enough for a book here. And I don't really think about it as having a common theme. But often when you write something in a compressed period, like say 3 years of your life, they do have a common theme because that's what you've been focused on during that time of your life. Truth-telling, I like the story and I felt it was a little bit startling, unusual. It's not I mean, it's a story, but there's nothing weird. It all could happen. My agent liked it for a title and my editor liked it for a title. So I thought, well, maybe that's the best one for a title. But then I began to think about all of them. And there's an element of truth-telling in all of them, even the ones that, for example, you haven't read the other, well, you have, but those other people haven't read the others. But there are some, like the Frenchman story. Of course, this could not happen, or it's highly unlikely. But there's a kind of truth. There's a truth in there that sometimes you do meet a person and you think, well, if this guy asked me, I'd run away with him tonight. Of course you don't. But the inner truth of that particular attraction that may last for a half hour is a truth about the narrator.
Two of my favorite, I really liked the Truth Style. I read that and then I didn't read the others, and then I sort of read the rest of them all at once. But Truthtelling read to me, and I've said that to you, like, one of the stories that you study when you first begin to write about how to tell a life within a story. You basically have this couple sitting down and they're confessing to, they're at the end of a long, pretty much happy marriage about some altercations that have happened, and so basically the surprise is the revelation of what they're saying to each other. And so you basically have encapsulated their entire relationship in the course of this conversation, including at the end going to bed together. You know what I mean? So these are older people, but they also they're still in love with each other. They still, have passion for each other, but it's a very, very, very precise story. I feel like all your years of writing, there's not excess language, there's not excess of scenes, everything is there. So it's really a wonderful, story to read and to probably teach as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I do think that, this story also is a real story. It's not a fantasy. It's not a glimpse. but I mean, it's a story. I don't mean it's real, but that everybody's lives have these secrets. A lot of people don't talk about them. They don't even talk about them to their friends, but they have them. Some are very serious, like having an abortion. Some are not so serious. I mean, the husband confesses that he told the wife he stopped smoking, but he secretly smoked in the office or something. I can't even remember. That's not so terrible. But they range, the truths range from little to big. And somehow this particular couple has managed to merge them and what am I trying to say? Work them into their lives.
Yeah.
Even after they know things that they wouldn't want to know them when they were happening.
Exactly. And it's very poignant and very moving, without being schmaltzy or overly romantic. I mean, they're wry, you have a real ability to sort of have emotion without being overly dramatic. There's a coolness to your work, I think, which even though some of your characters go mad, and some of them explode, but they're still, in the way that you tell it, there's a measured way of telling the stories. There's two very distinct New York stories which I wanted to talk about. One of them was the woman traveling on the bus, because everyone who's ever lived in New York or in a city where they've been on public transportation has probably experienced something like that. She's on a bus, she puts a backpack next to her, the bus is empty, and this guy gets on the bus and says, I want to sit next to you, can you move your backpack? And so she basically says, there's the whole bus, you don't have to sit here. And then it escalates. And I've been in buses where there have been confrontations. So I thought that was it was funny, but it was also really very realistic in terms of
those things do happen.
They do.
And there's also one where those were 4 separate stories, very tiny. They would really be glimpses. And then I decided, I could make them like a chain leading up to a climax, which happens in the last story when she's just so upset by what's going on around her. This train has stopped for a long time and it's dark and so on. But there was one that came out of real experience. I ride the buses a lot. And this older, not very appetizing man came and sat down next to a teenage girl in front of me. And I just sort of didn't like, there were empty seats too. I didn't like that he was sitting near her. I thought he had some ulterior motive, but I couldn't figure out how I could intervene, just intervene that way. But I dwelt on it for a while, and then that's how a story came out of it.
There's the one about the subway, which we've all been in that position, where you're on the subway, but it becomes almost like a musical motif. All of the announcements that you hear all the time, don't put your bags down, don't do this, we're going to move in 5 seconds. And that this woman basically It's almost like a volcanic geyser coming up in here. She can't take it anymore.
Exactly.
And that was a fantasy. I mean, I love that story because we've all been in that position, you know.
Well, the going up like a geyser is, but I think we've all felt, I can't take it anymore. But I said something in that story that I really do believe that I don't mean totally mentally ill people, but people who are on the edge, like a lot of us are these days. Um, you, uh, you don't want to lose control. You don't want to scream or do something crazy, but it's a matter of will. You can control yourself if you want to. But at the end, she screams and they come and take her away. But she said, I just didn't feel like controlling myself anymore. And I think that's the point. I think that does happen to a lot of people. You look at them, you think, you don't really have to be behaving this way.
Yeah.
And they say they know.
So what has it been like for you to work in a pandemic, to publish a book in a pandemic, to have to, publicize and reach people on Zoom and communication rather than in person?
Well, it's so different from all the other books I've published. It's very odd. It's very unpleasant. Although I received some good pre-publication reviews, and they came by email, so that was very nice. It's nice to find a good review in your mailbox. But it's sort of I don't know what will happen with real reviews. I've told people about the book. It's happening, but it's not happening. And my editor and the publicity people have been very helpful to try to make me feel this is real. But I sometimes doubt that it's real. Now that I have the book in my hand, I know that it's real. I haven't seen it in stores, but who goes into stores anymore? It's not been a great experience. I mean, as far as the publisher, it has been a good experience, but personally, it's like the stories themselves. I wonder, are they really happening, or is this a kind of semi-dream? And of course, bookstores. We all have to support bookstores because they're having a hard time.
And we're open, by the way. So all our locations are open from 11:30 to 7, and we observe all the PPE and all the sanitizing and everything. So if you get bored and you want to take a trip downtown or to Brooklyn bookstores, you can come and visit and see Lynn's book in person. How is your life different? When you live in New York, you have a certain circumscribed life anyway. How has your life changed because of the pandemic? How has your writing life changed?
Oh, well, in many ways. I just want to say something. You mentioned something about reading a moment ago. I just wanted to answer that. Of course, I read every night, and both my husband and I, we read so many books, I can't even remember what I read, and I forget them as soon as I stop reading them, which is something I'm not proud of. But there is one book that I really found helpful and inspiring, and this is a book I vowed to read, and it was The Prison Letters of Nelson Mandela. It's about 5 inches thick, and I bought it because I read a couple of them. And I didn't read them all at once. I read a few at a time, as many as I could stand. For he was in prison, I don't know, 30, 40 years of it. I said, I forget everything I read. And whenever I read those letters, I would think of, look at the situation he was up against, starting while apartheid was still in full force. And the letters are so full of hope and positive thinking and love for his family and his friends. And it really, I'm not usually one of these positive people, but I must say that book really helped me get through some of the darkest moments. And I finally got to the end of them when he's out and things are changing. But about change. So change. How has it changed my life? Well, first of all, I've lived in New York my whole life, except for a few years here and there, other places. So most of our friends are here, and they all left. Everybody went to Long Island or to upstate New York, to their houses. So suddenly we used to feel, we know so many people and it's hard to keep track, and we used to go out a lot. And we thought, don't we have any friends? Where are our friends? So there's an odd feeling of friendlessness. I know it's not true, but I was used to seeing a lot of people and talking, talking about my daily life. And what is even more stimulating was listening to them talk about their daily lives. You have coffee with a friend for an hour and a half, and you come away with so much to think about. She's told you so much, and you're sort of refreshed and renewed. And that has not been happening very often. Once in a while, every couple of weeks, I meet somebody, we sit out in the park, and it's starting to get cold. But it's a great change, and not a good one.
No. I was going to ask you, there's a lot of music in your stories. Are you a musician? Were there musicians in the family? Or are you just a music lover?
I am a music lover, but I do play the piano. I've played since I was about 6, and I played by ear. As a child, I was good at playing by ear, so they gave me lessons. My mother was even more musical. She was a wonderful singer, kind of a torch singer, Sophie Tucker type. I used to be able to sing, but I can't anymore. I mean, I didn't sing well. She sang well. She sang a little bit in public. And she could play the banjo, the mandolin, the accordion, the piano. You just put an instrument in her hands. So yes, we are musical, and I still love it, and I still play, although I played well when I was about 18. It's been downhill ever since then.
I tell you, my favorite story was Career Choice. I loved that story. I thought it was really, it comes in as one thing and it ends as something completely different and surprising. It's almost like a Saki story. And it's basically, for those who haven't read the book, a relatively young woman, she's 34, doesn't really have a vocation except she's been taking care of her sister who's had a debilitating illness. And she makes the decision that she's going to meet and marry an older man as a way of sort of giving herself, a destiny and a course in the future. And she does 3 things and one of them work out. And it becomes a love story. So, this woman who seems to be just very cold at the beginning, sort of detached from her feelings, probably forced to be so because of having to be a caretaker, I think, who loved her sister, lost her sister. It becomes this kind of beautiful love story. And I really encourage people to read it. I thought it was really beautiful. And it seems to be one of the few pieces, maybe because of its length, that wasn't published on its own.
That could be also because it was written very recently. I just wrote, what is this? You lose track of, we're in almost November. It's one of the most recent in the last few months, late enough to be printed in the book. That story, I like the way you describe it because it really got away from me, as sometimes stories do. I wrote it because my editor and I, and maybe he's here, Joel Oshen, we have a common interest in Italy. We both know the language, and I've translated, and he's lived there. So he said, why don't you use your knowledge of Italian in a story? And I needed some more stories. I thought, okay, that's a good idea. So I thought I could use language, and I did. I used, there are funny little bits regarding language. But it turns out language is not really the essence of the story at all. It just got away, and it wanted to do its own thing. And you're right, the heroine who starts out, tough, a tough chick, and she wants to get, she reads a book and she gets annoyed. This did happen to me. Not the rest of it didn't. But she read a book by a real author who, it's a real book that exists. I'm not going to say what it is. A very old man, an old author. And it's about an old man who, and his caregiver falls in love with him first. She's young and he's this old half-dead body in a bed, and she loves him, and finally loves her. And I got annoyed. I thought, well, this is that all they can think about is that a young woman loves them even when they're at death's door. And the character thinks that too. And she says, okay, if that's the way it is, I'm still young enough. I'm 34. I'll find one. And she goes out and she looks for one, and she takes classes in Italian. So that was really the rather, what's the word? It was sort of harsh, cynical outlook with which I began the story. And then it just changed. I don't know what happened. But yes, I like it much better that it didn't remain harsh and cynical. And it is possible that this kind of love can exist.
Where I wanted to begin, but which I'm going to talk about now, this morning I was reading Literary Hub, and they had an interview with Hilary Mantel. And she was saying that, you don't really learn much from interviews with writers. But she said she was once in St. Louis and she heard Salman Rushdie say in a discussion that there's only one question to ask an author. And that is, you point to a sentence and say, how did it get there? And then a tale unfolds in the book's hinterland. You get to see the shadows moving behind the substance, which I thought was fantastic. And I think in a way, the way that you described writing this story, Career Change, is an insight into that. It's like, when you feel you're in control of your craft or your skills, and you start with something that's very ephemeral, or, your editor says, write about Italy, or you read this book, and then somehow that, becomes the genesis of a story. Could you talk about another story in the collection in that way, like, how it began and how it gestated?
Yes, well, in line with what you were just saying and what you said, Rushdie said, I've always thought fiction is exaggeration. You take a little thing that may have happened to you, like I read this book by this old author, and blow it up into something big. Even in a marriage, maybe I think I did. I told my husband I would stop smoking, but I really didn't. So I mean, that's not a terrible lie. So then I made up all these other lies. So yeah, I'll talk about a story called An Impromptu Visit, which is based on something that really happened to my daughter and me. I think she's here in one of those little boxes. We were caught in a terrible rainstorm going home from visiting my brother, or perhaps my parents, up in Rockland County. And I'm not the world's greatest driver, to say the least. So we just can't do this. I can't do this anymore. So we stopped and we knocked on someone's door on a suburban street, and a woman let us in. And I called my brother, who was always very helpful, lived about 20 miles away. And I said, look, I can't drive anymore. Please come and get us. A nice woman let us. And he came and got us and he drove us home. I mean, that was the whole thing. It's not very dramatic. But it's such an interesting incident, that we did this in the first place, that what happens in the story is that the woman, she's always been very dependent on her brother getting her out of jams, which is not the case with me. She sees a beautiful little Japanese figurine as she's shown through the woman's house. It was a little Buddha. And she thinks, I just must have this. She's coming through as a little bit irresponsible. She's brought up her daughter all right. The kid is about 17. She does her best, but she does not have it all together in her life. And she can't resist. She takes it and puts it in her pocket. Now, I don't have these instincts only in places like, in places like, remember Woolworths? That doesn't exist anymore. But these general stores, things are so tiny. I always wanted to grab something, but I didn't have the nerve. She acts on this impulse, and then she at home she realizes this is wrong. I don't really want to keep it. I just wanted to have it in my pocket. I'll send it back. But she realizes she can't send it back. She doesn't know the woman's name or her address. And anyway, she's stuck with the results of her bad act. So there too, there's a kind of truth. There's a kind of truth in that. She's been that way all her life. She's not really a thief, but she's always wanted to depend on people or take things without having earned them. And here is, it come right back at her. Now it's happened.
There's a lot of, one of the themes that I saw in the book, there are these women who, like there's even the story where there's a found me, there's a fake self that is the split of the person is the divided self.
Yes.
And so there are these women who sort of are trying to break out it through their imagination, who feel caught by circumstances or like in the Golden Rule, the story about someone who feels that they've been trapped by their obligations. I mean, that's another very New York story, where you feel that your generosity is being taken advantage of. And that too has a surprise ending, so there are these women sort of who are on their own. Some of them are very much in control of their situation. Some of them are imagining different lives. They're at a certain point of their lives, but they're not depressed. That's what I think was very singularly distinctive about your writing, Lynn, is that there isn't like these drug addicts or, that there are all these women who are very much present, reflecting or moving forward, and they're strong figures. I mean, I enjoyed that a lot. And the last story I'll talk about before we'll open it to the audience is a great revenge story. And I think would make a great movie. Like I could even see the actresses in it, is when the ex-wife goes to that sort of a manor upstate. It sounded to me like Westport, of the ex-husband who married
Dust. Yeah.
The girlfriend and is really stuck, and she reminded me of Harriet Walter. I don't know if you know Harriet Walter was playing, I can't remember what she was in, but she comes back on the occasion of their son coming back from Europe with his wife and baby, and goes into this life that her ex-husband has created, and he's miserable. So there's great satisfaction on her part. She doesn't gloat, she's not mean, but she's this cool observational presence and sort of happy to be where she is and happy that he's suffering, So I thought that was a beautiful story as well.
Thank you. Well, that was based on something a friend told me. Again, not exactly, but I get my ideas from the little things people say, which is why I said I miss meeting people for coffee in the afternoon. And they tell me these things, and and then a year or two later, they become stories.
Do they recognize themselves when you publish them?
Well, this person is dead, so it's like if you wouldn't. I got another story from her. And I kept to it pretty closely, and I didn't feel comfortable about publishing it. I'm not the kind of writer who thinks, the devil may care, write anything about anyone. And, I don't do that. I don't write about my family very much, and I just don't think you have to hurt people just to be an artist. But in any case, this other story that I thought it would hurt this friend if I published it. And I showed it to her and I said, would this hurt you if I publish it? She said, yes. So I said, well, I will publish it. Not that it's so easy for me to publish in large places, it isn't. But I said, I will publish this in the most obscure magazine that I can find. And I did. Yeah. And maybe nobody read it, but I wanted it out there. And I just didn't want to do that to her. Yeah, there's the majority school of thought among writers is, write anything and don't worry about hurting people, but I don't share that. I don't think the artist is a special person.
I think so. I think so too. And the story that you wrote about the father dying and the aunt coming to visit him, is that based on your family's history?
Yes.
I thought it was very interesting. Coming from Odessa and a big family and what became of them. It was a very powerful story as well.
Yes. Well, the thing that there's always one thing that, I mean, we don't all, but we all go through deaths of loved ones, and there are always little scenes that stick with you. And I did go through something like this with my father, and I have an aunt like that. But the thing that was worse, she came and he was out of it. I guess he was not more than sleeping. He was not conscious. And she came and she went to his eye and she lifted, made him. And I was so horrified and offended by the intimacy of that gesture that I think the story grew out of that.
It's a beautiful story. Anyway, Maris, I'm going to bring Maris back in. Is she there?
Yes. Hi.
Okay. Do we have any really interesting any questions?
We sure do. We have a question from Ellen, who says she'd like to ask Lynn, most of your writing has been pretty realistic, naturalistic. This collection has many stories that are surreal and wildly imaginative and not naturalistic. Did you decide to make that change, go into that territory, or how did that come about?
Well, that's an important question. Yes, I mean, it's very true. I had felt for a long time that there was a voice in there in me that wanted to come out that really wasn't that was not all there was to my writing voice. It's as if, you know, I could harmonize with, I had two levels. And writing these stories, I felt I touched part of my writing sensibility that I hadn't gone through before. It was lurking and it wanted to come out. To write a story like The Frenchman, I couldn't have done that 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I didn't have the freedom to do something like that, to just, you know, go out there and be wild and not worry about whether people would say, oh, this could never happen, or what, is it real? I didn't care anymore. And there are many of the stories are based on that kind of finding of freedom. And I'm glad I lived long enough to find it, because you know, I probably won't have many more like that.
Irina asks, can you talk about how you've honed your writerly narrative voice? So related, I feel like I know when I encounter a LSS story, the prose is intimate, unpretentious, discursive, mesmerizing, almost in the vein of oral storytelling. Was it that way from the beginning?
Oh, that's a good question.
I don't know as far as honed it. Yeah, I do work very hard on the sentences, and they have to sound right. I try to get a tone that, well, it's different for each story, but it's sort of cool. I think Cheryl mentioned the word rye before, and I had a friend who called me the mistress of rye, and that is a good part of me. I usually, I used to write more by hand, and I'd write fast, you know, anything. I mean, a sentence could be ugly and misshapen, and I just let it go, or do the whole thing. And then I would type it up, and I had to work on each sentence to try to make it beautiful. Not always, you know, not a thing of beauty, but to make it better, to make it work. So I just worked very hard on that. And if it's not, I learned somewhere around the early parts of my writing that there's sometimes, I'm sure all those of you who are writers, and I know Irina is, you know, you get to a point and something is nagging at you about this sentence, but you think, oh, it's really nothing much, I'll just go on. Well, you have to stop. You can't let anything go. You have to stop right there and fix it. Because if you start letting things go, it'll all get sloppy, and you'll lose that smooth, perfect tone you're looking for.
Good. Anybody else?
Yeah, those are the only questions in the chat so far, but please enter them and I will relay them.
I think. Is there anything that you feel that we need to know about this work, in terms of the way it was created, that we couldn't get by just reading the book?
I don't know what you need to know. I think the most important thing is what I was talking about before, and what I wrote about why did I change from the, you know, the competent or able realistic writer into this, I don't know, surreal, not quite right. It means a great deal to me. It means a discovery of a kind of freedom. And I thought to myself, maybe it was the last novel I wrote, that I don't want to write a regular novel anymore. You know, they're fine. I like to read them, but I just don't want to do this anymore. I want to see what else I can dig out of me. And that's the most important thing. That's what this book means to me at this point. And then I did start to write a realistic novel, and I find I'm having a very hard time going on with it. So we'll see.
One of the stories which I didn't talk about, which I loved, was Castles in the Air. which is this little, and it reminded me of two stories. It reminded me of James Salter wrote a story about a man where the man has fallen off a horse and he's narrating the last moments of his life, which is this great short story. And it reminded me also of Cynthia Ozick's Envy or Yiddish in America, about them making a pact with the devil to write a perfect story with the perfect translation, but you have to throw out the pages. That's the deal with the devil, like the Gerthian devil. So this is a story where a man is dying and he finally sees the perfect story and then he dies. He's built this castle, and it's really, really, it's a beautiful little story, and it's sort of like all of our fantasies as writers, but we want to do it in our lifetime.
Well, that story, that's the only one, well, maybe one other, that I can really say is autobiographical, because I had been having trouble writing, and I imagined this man, and he's dying, and just give me one more story before I have to go. And he sees it as yes, it's like a I can't remember it really. It's a little brick, and then it grows and grows, and he doesn't have to write it down. It's enough to have it in his head that he has the ability to make one more thing. Well, I'm glad you like that story. I wrote it very quickly, and I wasn't even sure whether to include it. It seemed so self-indulgent,
but I
because it
think
really was how I felt.
But I think it's not necessarily something that you feel as an old person, but I think every time a writer finishes a project that's probably taken a lot of energy or physical stamina, you sit down to write the next thing and you just want to say, where is my idea coming from? You're just praying for something. And it's something, songwriters say it, playwrights say it, any artists say it. And it just really captured that feeling, just one more, and the way it comes, and the satisfaction of feeling you can still do it.
Well, the thing that I've had ups and downs in my writing, sometimes I finish something I like and I can go right into the next. And very often, as you said, where will the next thing come from? But the one book that really put me in a bad mood was, it was called Two-Part Inventions. It's a musical. It's a pun, but that's a musical form Bach used. Because that book was based on, was what did they call it? Ripped from the headlines. It was a story I read about in the newspapers and in the New Yorker. It was they carried out a deception regarding her piano playing. It was really somebody else. It's too long to go into. But I was fascinated, and I decided I'll make that into a novel. And I made her grow up in Brooklyn the way I did, and I changed lots of things. But the basic story was the same. I knew where it was going. In the end, they carry out this scheme. I was never sure whether the husband does it on his own or whether they do it together. They carry out this scheme, and they're found out, and it's bad. And I wrote as if I were heading toward a brick wall. When I get to the end, I hit the wall, just because I knew what had to happen. And I thought, I will never do that again. I will never write something that isn't wide open from the start. And after that, I found it hard to go back, but I did. I think I wrote nonfiction after that.
So Maris, I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions.
We have a great craft question from Mary Holden. She says, a short story has an arc. Does a glimpse have an arc?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yes, a glimpse has an arc. Let me think of a glimpse. Yeah, like there's the glimpse I talked about earlier, the wrong number, the phone call. It starts out, it's maybe a page and a half. Very simply, hello, I'm calling to tell you I'm breaking up with you. Sorry, wrong number. I don't even know who you are. Wait a minute, you know who I am. And then it goes on, it builds up and builds up. So it starts with a very simple thing. And then it goes to a point where finally it gets more and more intense. And why doesn't she hang up? That's a good question. And when finally it's over, she thinks, well, who is breaking up with me? Who is this? Is somebody breaking up with me? So it has an arc, from the innocent or, commonplace, I should say, beginning through the middle, the kind of disbelief, and through the end, when the caller has almost convinced the recipient that it's real. So that's an arc.
Yes.
This is a good question to end on from Barbara. Which writers, Lynn, do you read again and again? And are there novels you'll reread?
I used to keep a list of writers I loved, so that if I was ever asked that question, I would have something to say. They all go out of my head. Well, I mean, nothing unusual. The greats, I used to read a lot of Henry James. I don't think I can do that anymore. I've had it. And I love Proust. I never finished it, but I'm waiting to go back to it. Sometimes you feel, I get it enough. Natalia Ginsberg, the great Italian writer who I have translated, I do go back to her work because I've learned so much from that. They're very simple, deceptively simple style.
Mm-hmm.
Who else can I say? I'm losing. There's a novel I admired very much by a British writer called Graham Swift, Waterland. It's a long time ago.
This was his first
Barbara
novel.
Pym. Yeah, his first novel. I think it was the best.
Yeah.
Barbara Pym, who, if you haven't read, you should immediately go out and read, because she died in the 70s. So she's, to me, sort of a contemporary writer. She is comical, but also you glimpse in a deep sadness and loneliness in her characters' lives. But they're so funny that you don't know whether to laugh or cry.
Mm-hmm.
She's been talked about as a modern Jane Austen, and the humor, it's true, but to me, she's not like Jane Austen. Anyway, I love her, and well, that's enough of people I love. I
Okay.
can't remember them.
Well, I think this was a great conversation, Lynn. And I hope it fulfills some of your need to have conversations that you haven't had.
Thank you. It certainly did.
And then, Maris is going to put the link to buy this lovely book, and, come to our event page. I have some conversations going on in November. Read Lynn's book, support your independent bookstores. And thank you again for giving me this time this evening to talk with you.
I want to thank you and Maris again. It's been a pleasure, and thank all of you people up there for coming. I really appreciate
no
it.
conversation without a supportive audience.
Thank you. Now I'm going to click and see who's here.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.